The evening had started like any other. Thomas, with his usual charm, had been entertaining our guests, family mostly, with a few close friends, and everything seemed to fall into place as it always did. He had a way of making people feel at ease, telling stories of his latest projects at work, effortlessly drawing attention to himself without much effort. I sat back in my seat, half listening, half laughing, playing my part in the well-rehearsed dance that had become my life. The house smelled of roast chicken, the scent mixing with the faint aroma of wine that had already begun to make its rounds. I'd prepared for this. I always did. We all did. A happy home, a pleasant family gathering, and everything was supposed to feel warm and comforting. That was the surface, anyway. Beneath it, things had been shifting for a while. But I kept those thoughts buried. It was easier that way. My gaze drifted to Marcus, Thomas's younger brother, who sat on the opposite end of the dining table. He always felt like an afterthought in these gatherings. Tall, with an awkward kind of charm, Marcus had never quite found his place in our family. Even now, as he smiled politely and nodded along with Thomas's latest story, I could see the distance between him and the rest of us. It wasn't malicious, just uncomfortable. He often tried too hard, like he was seeking approval he wasn't sure he'd ever get. And then there was the moment that changed everything. I don't know why it happened the way it did, or what exactly made him ask. But Marcus turned toward me, his eyes gleaming with a mischievous sort of spark. He leaned in slightly, almost conspiratorially, and asked, "Am I the best you've ever had?" I froze, the glass of wine I was holding almost slipping from my hand. The room went quiet for a split second, as though time had stopped. I didn't know how to respond. Was he joking? Was he serious? It was absurd. He couldn't be serious, could he? But there he was, waiting for my answer, that arrogant little smile on his lips, like he was expecting something profound or flattering in return. I couldn't help myself. I laughed. Not in a mocking way, but in disbelief. It wasn't a laugh of joy or amusement, but one of pure shock. The absurdity of the question hit me all at once. My laugh echoed through the room, sharp and loud, breaking the silence in a way that felt uncomfortable. "Are you serious?" I blurted out, still chuckling as I looked around the table. Thomas was staring at me, his face frozen in an expression of disbelief. The rest of the guests seemed unsure of what to do, exchanging nervous glances, but no one dared to speak up. Marcus, however, didn't seem to like the way I'd reacted. His smile faltered for a moment, and a shadow of something, embarrassment, maybe, flashed across his face. It was so brief, most wouldn't have noticed, but I saw it. For a second, I almost felt bad for him. But then, I remembered all the times he'd pushed boundaries with his little jokes, the times he'd made me uncomfortable without even realizing it. Thomas cleared his throat, breaking the silence, but instead of laughing it off like I expected, he spoke in a quiet voice that held an edge. "Come on, let's not make this weird," he said, looking from me to his brother. His voice was strained, and I could tell he was trying to smooth over the awkwardness, to re-establish control over the situation. I swallowed the remnants of my laughter, suddenly aware that I'd crossed some unspoken line. The guests around the table awkwardly shifted in their seats. Marcus' eyes, which had initially held a hint of challenge, now looked a little wounded, like he didn't know how to play the game anymore. I'd taken something from him, without even meaning to. And for some reason, that realization made my stomach tighten in an unexpected way. The rest of the dinner continued with an undercurrent of tension that none of us could ignore. Every now and then, I'd catch Marcus' gaze across the table, and he would quickly look away. The others, of course, pretended as if nothing had happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed in that brief moment. I'd laughed, and in doing so, I had broken something. As the night wore on, I found myself retreating into my thoughts, watching as Thomas played the gracious host, as if nothing had changed. But I couldn't forget. I couldn't shake the weight of Marcus's question and the way my response had shattered whatever fragile peace had existed between us. The laughter that had once come so easily now felt hollow. When the last of the guests finally left, I was left alone with Thomas, cleaning up the remnants of the evening. The clinking of dishes was the only sound filling the house. Thomas didn't speak at first, and I wondered if he was waiting for me to say something. But I wasn't sure what to say. I didn't feel guilty, but I didn't know how to explain the rush of emotions that had come with Marcus's question, or how it had triggered something deep within me. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice low. "You shouldn't have laughed like that," he said, his words sharp, though he was careful not to raise his voice. I looked at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to understand where he was coming from. He shook his head, the frustration evident in his eyes. "You humiliated him. And you humiliated me." His words hit me like a slap, more forceful than I was prepared for. It wasn't just about the question, it was about the way you dismissed him. My mind was spinning, but I couldn't stop myself from asking, "Are you really taking his side in this?" Thomas didn't answer right away. He didn't have to. I could see it in his eyes, the flicker of something that I had ignored for far too long. There was a distance between us now, one that hadn't been there before. And in that silence, I realized that something had broken, something that I couldn't put back together. I turned away, focusing on the dishes, the mundane task helping me avoid the conversation that I knew was coming. But it didn't stop the knot in my stomach. Something had shifted, and I wasn't sure I could ever go back to the way things were. The next morning, the house felt unusually empty. Thomas had left without a word, his car gone before I even opened my eyes. The silence between us after last night's dinner still lingered, thick and suffocating. The events from the night before seemed like they happened in another life, but they were far from over. I could feel it in my bones, the tension hadn't dissipated, it had only deepened. I dragged myself out of bed, feeling like I was moving through molasses. My mind was foggy, and my body felt as though it had been drained of energy. The house was quiet, too quiet. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the distant echo of birds chirping outside. I made coffee, but it didn't taste right. Everything felt off, like a low hum under everything I did, a constant reminder of what had unfolded just hours earlier. I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair where Thomas usually sat. There was no apology, no explanation, just the cold emptiness that lingered between us. I wasn't sure how I felt about it. Anger, confusion, maybe a little relief. The way he'd spoken to me last night, the way he'd turned my laughter into something to be ashamed of, had cracked something inside of me. But I still didn't know how to approach it. Was it worth fighting for, this marriage? Or had we already crossed a point of no return? The phone on the table buzzed, pulling me from my thoughts. It was a message from Thomas. My heart skipped a beat, but I didn't rush to read it. Instead, I sat there, staring at the screen for a moment before unlocking it. "Can we meet?" The message was short, direct, and to the point. He wanted to meet. But why? Was this his way of trying to fix things? I wasn't sure I was ready to face him. I wasn't sure I wanted to. But I knew I had no choice. We needed to talk, whether I was ready or not. I agreed to meet him at the cafe we'd gone to for our anniversary last year. It seemed fitting. The place held so many memories, but in a way, it felt like a graveyard of all the promises we'd made to each other. When I arrived, I spotted him right away, sitting by the window, looking exactly like he always did, put together, calm, almost too calm. His expression was unreadable, and it irritated me more than I cared to admit. He didn't look up when I approached, didn't greet me with his usual smile or affectionate gesture. Instead, he gestured to the chair across from him, his eyes never meeting mine. I sat down slowly, feeling the weight of the situation pressing in on me. Neither of us spoke for a moment, just sat there in the heavy silence, like we were waiting for the other to break first. But no one spoke. The awkwardness was unbearable. Finally, Thomas broke the silence. "You embarrassed me last night," he said, his voice low, but there was no mistaking the edge in his words. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even an accusation. It was a statement of fact, as though he were telling me something I should already know. I sat back in my chair, crossing my arms over my chest. I wasn't going to back down. "I didn't mean to," I said, my voice steady, though my hands were clenched in my lap. "But I'm not going to apologize for laughing." His eyes narrowed, and I could feel the frustration building in him. "You humiliated Marcus. You humiliated me, too. Do you even realize that?" "I don't think it was about humiliating anyone," I replied, my words coming out more forcefully than I intended. "I was just caught off guard. The question was ridiculous." "You didn't have to laugh like that," he snapped, his voice rising just a little. "It wasn't funny, and you know it. You made a scene." I felt a wave of frustration wash over me. "You're making it sound like I did something unforgivable." "It was a stupid comment, Thomas. That's all." He leaned forward, his eyes suddenly cold. "It wasn't just about the comment. It's about how you react to things, how you treat people when they don't measure up to your standards. You make everyone around you feel small." I blinked, shocked by the sharpness of his words. "What are you talking about?" I whispered, almost unable to believe what I was hearing. "I didn't make anyone feel small. You're the one who's always acting like you're better than everyone else, like you're in charge of everything." His face twitched, a flicker of something in his eyes, anger? Regret? I couldn't tell. But I could tell he wasn't expecting my response. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest, his eyes not meeting mine. "You've been distant lately," he said, his voice quieter now. "You don't talk to me anymore. You don't seem to care. And I don't know what's going on with you, but it's starting to get to me." I felt my stomach tighten. The words hit me harder than I expected, even though I'd been expecting something like this. I had distanced myself from him, that was true. But it wasn't because I didn't care. It was because I'd been suffocating in this marriage, buried beneath the weight of expectations, under the shadow of a man who couldn't see me for who I was anymore. "I don't know how to talk to you, Thomas," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "I don't know how to explain everything that's been building up. It's not just about last night. It's about everything." He stared at me, his face unreadable. "What are you saying?" "I don't know if I can do this anymore," I whispered, barely able to hear my own voice. "I don't know if I can keep pretending that everything's fine when it's not." There it was. The truth I'd been avoiding. It hung in the air between us, thick and undeniable. For a long moment, Thomas didn't speak. His eyes were on me, but it felt like he wasn't really seeing me. His lips were pressed into a thin line, his jaw clenched as if he was trying to process what I had just said. Finally, he stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I can't deal with this right now," he said, his voice flat, as though the conversation had already ended. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving me sitting there in stunned silence. I watched him go, my heart pounding in my chest, but I didn't chase after him. I couldn't. The weight of his words had broken something in me. Something I wasn't sure I could ever put back together. I sat there for a long time, staring out the window, not knowing where to go from here. The days following our confrontation were a blur. I spent most of them in the house, moving through the motions of my routine, but nothing felt right. The weight of what had been said hung over me, pressing down with every step I took. Thomas had stopped texting, calling, anything. It was as if he had vanished. I told myself I was fine, that I could move on, but deep down, I felt the absence of something I didn't fully understand. I kept telling myself that I'd made the right decision. After all, how long could I continue pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't? How long could I keep playing this role, this part in a marriage that had lost its spark, its warmth? Yet, with every passing day, the silence between us began to weigh heavier. It was as if we had reached the point of no return. We had become strangers, and I couldn't even pinpoint when or how it had happened. Then, on the fourth day, I got a call from Marcus. "Hey," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Can we talk?" The question was unexpected, and I hesitated for a moment before answering. Marcus had been distant since that night, too. It wasn't that we hadn't spoken, but there was always an uncomfortable undercurrent between us. I hadn't expected him to reach out now, especially not after everything that had happened. But something about his tone made me want to listen. I agreed to meet him at a small park just a few blocks away. I didn't know what to expect, but something in my gut told me this conversation was going to be important. I arrived first, sitting on one of the benches, my hands folded tightly in my lap. The air was crisp, the kind of coolness that felt like a reminder of the changing seasons, of how everything was shifting, moving, even when I didn't want it to. A few minutes later, I saw Marcus approaching. He was walking slowly, his hands stuffed deep in the pockets of his coat. His face was serious, and I could see that something had been weighing on him. He sat down next to me without saying anything at first. The silence stretched between us, awkward and heavy. "I've been thinking a lot," he began, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "About last night. And about everything that's been going on." I nodded, though I wasn't sure what to say. I had my own thoughts, my own questions, but for some reason, I was afraid to voice them. What was there left to say? "I know I asked something stupid," Marcus continued, his eyes focused on the ground in front of him. "And I shouldn't have. But I just wanted to know, you know? I wanted to feel like I mattered." His words caught me off guard. I turned to look at him, really look at him for the first time since that night. The vulnerability in his voice, the raw honesty, was unlike anything I had expected. I'd always seen him as the awkward, aloof brother who never quite fit in, but now, I saw the cracks in his armor. I saw the person beneath the surface, and it made my heart ache. "You do matter, Marcus," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. You don't always know how to ask for it. You don't always know how to be honest with the people around you." He nodded, his lips tight. There was a long pause, and I could feel the weight of what was unsaid between us. It wasn't just about that night, about the question he'd asked me. It was about everything that had built up between us, years of unspoken tension, of words left unsaid. It was about the way we'd both been avoiding the truth. "I don't know what to do anymore," I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "With Thomas, with everything. I don't know where we go from here." Marcus turned to me, his eyes softening. "You've got to figure that out, don't you? I don't think it's just about the question, or about laughing. It's about something deeper, something that's been festering for a long time. You've been holding back, and I can see it. I think you've been holding back from him for a long time, too. I felt the truth of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. He was right. I had been holding back, not just from Thomas, but from myself. I had convinced myself that everything was fine, that I could keep living this life in a way that didn't require me to face what I truly needed. But Marcus was right. I was avoiding the truth, avoiding the pain that had been there all along. You need to decide, then, he said, his voice steady now. What's worth saving? And what's not? His question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of all that had happened. I turned it over in my mind, again and again. Was it worth saving? Could it be saved? And if so, what would it take? More than I had to give? More than I even wanted to give? I took a deep breath, looking at the sky above us, the clouds drifting lazily by. I could feel the cold wind against my skin, but it didn't bother me. There was something about it that was cleansing, like it was helping me clear my head, helping me come to terms with the fact that things couldn't go on like this forever. Something had to change. I don't know, I finally said, the words feeling heavy in my chest. But I think I know what I have to do. Marcus gave me a small, understanding nod. Whatever you decide, just make sure it's your choice. Don't let anyone else make it for you. I sat there for a while longer, in the silence that had become my constant companion, trying to make sense of it all. When I stood to leave, I felt a strange kind of peace wash over me. It wasn't the peace I had hoped for, the kind that would fix everything, but it was a start. A step forward. I walked home in a daze, my thoughts a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. When I stepped inside the house, everything felt different. The silence was still there, but it wasn't the same. It wasn't suffocating anymore. Thomas was sitting on the couch, his back to me. He didn't hear me come in, and for a moment, I just stood there, watching him. It was strange, how far apart we had grown, how little we knew each other anymore. I could feel the weight of the decision I was about to make. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be quick. But it had to be done. Thomas, I said, my voice firm, but quiet. He turned slowly, his eyes searching mine, and in that moment, I knew. I knew that no matter how hard it would be, I had made my choice. I think it's time, I said, my heart pounding in my chest. It's time to stop pretending.